Hello everyone, it's Scott and we're back with day 4 of Bloomburrow spoilers. We got a lot of interesting cards to dive into today, but before we do, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Bloomburrow spoiler season and beyond. Our first card of the day is Season of the Burrow. For 3 and 2 white mana. You get a sorcery and choose up to 5 paws worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. So for 1 paw, you can create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token. For 2 paws, you can exile target non-land permanent. Its controller draws a card. And for 3 paws, you can return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. So I think all 3 modes are usable on Season of Burrow, and because of that, I think it might possibly be the best one so far, because you can potentially exile 2 of your opponent's non-land permanents. It's not just creatures, it could be planeswalkers, enchantments, artifacts. So whatever you need to get rid of, you can do that twice with Season of Burrow, plus get a rabbit token. So I think this has definitely got standard playability. It will certainly be a sideboard card in white decks, and I think it's main deckable in the right build. Next, we've got Starfall Invocation for 3 and 2 white mana. You get a sorcery with gift a card. Destroy all creatures. If the gift was promised, return a creature card put into your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. So 5 mana for a board wipe. We know we've got a new board wipe coming later this fall. That'll be a 4 mana board wipe like this. But for that extra mana to be able to, in essence, save one of your creatures and bring it back from the graveyard, I think that makes this one a very playable board wipe in Standard. Next, we've got Helga, Skittish Seer for a green, a white, and a blue mana. You legendary creature that's a frog druid, and whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4 or greater, you draw a card, gain 1 life, and put a +1/+1 counter on Helga, Skittish Seer. And Helga is a 1/3 when she comes into play, but basically every time you're going to cast a 4 mana spell, you're going to give her a +1 counter and keep growing Helga throughout the course of the game. And you can also tap Helga to add X mana of any one color, where X is Helga Skittish Seer's power. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells with mana value 4 or greater, or creature spells with X in their mana cost. So I think Helga is a good card. So if there's a Bant deck that does form, I think she fits into it well, particularly if that Bant deck has larger creatures. And the reason that I think this is going to be good is when we get to Foundations, we're going to get Lion War Elves back. So when we get Lion or Elf back, then what we'll see is you do your Elf on turn 1 to add green mana, and hopefully you've been able to play a dual land to get white and blue mana, and you can potentially cast Helga as early as turn 2. And if you're able to do that by turn 3, you can cast any larger creature you want, because you're going to have at a minimum 5 mana to spend at that point. And if that's the case, I think you're going to be able to advance your board state very quickly and hopefully move quickly to win the game. Next, we've got Darkstar Augur for 2 and a black mana. You get a Bat Warlock. That's a 2/3 with Offspring of a black mana. And you may pay an additional black mana as you cast the spell. If you do, when this creature enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 token copy of it, which I think is, in this particular case, a potentially very powerful ability. It has flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand, you lose life equal to its mana value. So this is one of those cards that I think is either going to be really powerful and really good in Standard, or it's not going to work at all. And I think it's going to work because we already have the makings of a decent bat deck. We've already got Deep Cavern Bat and a few other bats that have lifelink. So if we put Darkstar Augur in a deck with other cards that have lifelink, so you're gaining life as the game goes on, basically you're countering the effect of getting that extra card every turn. And I think, in my mind, that's enough to make this definitely standard playable, and it might even be playable in other formats as well. Next, we've got Byway Barterer for 2 and a red mana. You get a Raccoon Rogue, that's a 3/3 with Menace. And whenever you expend 4, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 2 cards. So Byway Barterer, I think, could be a very, very powerful card in the right deck in Standard. And again, it's going to be a deck where you're going to be casting 4 mana spells on a consistent basis, and then you cast something, you hopefully have no cards in your hand, and then you can discard your hand, i.e. no cards, and then draw 2, and then you're refilling your hand quickly as you go throughout the game. And I think if we can find the right deck for this, it has definite standard playability, and might even have some playability in Pioneer in a larger creature style deck. Next, we've got Hearthborn Battler for 2 and a red mana. You get a Lizard Warlock with haste. He's a 2/3. And whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Hearthborn Battler deals 2 damage to target opponent. So this is a really interesting card to me because in some ways it fits into the prowess style decks that are already in Standard, whether it's the Gruul version or the mono red version, because you're trying to cast multiple spells a turn anyways, and getting the advantage of dealing additional damage to your opponent every time you cast your second spell or they cast a second spell on a turn, I think is a tremendous amount of value in Standard. So I think this is a card that's going to be at least a couple copies in red decks. Next, we've got Wick the World Mind for 3 and a black mana. You get a legendary creature that's a rat warlock and is a 2/4. And whenever Wick or another rat you control enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black snail creature token if you don't control a snail. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on a snail you control. And then for a blue, a black, and a red mana, you can sacrifice a snail, and Wick deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to each opponent. Then draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Okay, so obviously this is going to want to be in a Grixis style deck so you can get advantage of that sack ability. But simply by playing a rats deck where you're going to be able to consistently give additional +1/+1 counters to your snail, and then in the late game you can sacrifice it hopefully to do the final damage to an opponent to win the game. So if a rat deck does form, I think Wick is a card that the deck will want. The question is, can we get it into the Grixis colors to make it work and use Wick's ability? Next, we've got Mockingbird for X and a blue mana. You get a Bird Bard, that's a 1/1 with flying. And you may have Mockingbird enter as a copy of another creature on the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the mana spent to cast Mockingbird, except it is a bird in addition to its other types and has flying. So this is, in essence, come in and you get to copy something, you get to pay the mana cost of that creature, but in the late game, this is, in my mind, a really powerful card because you're copying another card, so you're going to get all the abilities on that card. And one thing I can definitely say about this set is that there are so many abilities on cards that copying something in the mid to late game and giving an additional boost to your creatures, I think is worth it in Standard. So I think we're going to see Mockingbird in any kind of blue deck that has an aggro feel to it. Now let's talk about some lower rarity cards that have some Standard playability. First is Driftgloom Coyote for 3 and 2 white mana. You get an Elemental Coyote, that's a 3/4, and when Driftgloom Coyote enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Driftwood Coyote leaves the battlefield. If that creature had power 2 or less, put a +1/+1 counter on Driftgloom Coyote. So this is potentially a replacement for Brutal Cathar, but obviously it's 2 mana more for this. So I think it's, if there's really a need for that in Standard in a white deck, then maybe you go for this. But definitely in Limited, this is a solid playable card. Star Charter for 3 and a white mana is a Bat Cleric with flying and is a 3/1. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with power 3 or less from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So if we do end up with a Bat deck, I think even though this is 4 mana, I think it goes in it because a number of the bats that are already in Standard are lifelinkers, so you're likely to get some damage through where you gain life as a result of it. And because of that, I think Star Charter in a bat deck makes some sense in Standard. Next, we've got Nettle Guard for 1 and a white mana. You get a Mouse Soldier. That's a 3/1 with Valiant. And whenever Nettle Guard becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, it gets +0/+2 until end of turn. And you can pay 1 mana and sacrifice Nettle Guard to destroy a target artifact or enchantment. And that, I think, is the thing that's going to make Nettle Guard part of any mouse deck that we see, and potentially a sideboard card in other decks, because we've seen throughout the last 5 or 6 years, we always seem to have a white creature card that's a soldier typically, that you can sacrifice it and kill an artifact or an enchantment. And since the previous version is rotating out, this will take its place in Standard. Next, we've got Otter Sport for 1 and a blue mana. You get a sorcery where you get to create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. And if this spell was cast from anywhere other than your hand, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. It has flashback of 3 and a blue mana. So I like this card. It may fit into an otter deck in Standard, or more precisely, a blue-red prowess deck in Standard, where this is just a way to get an additional activation of prowess, but also get an additional prowess creature onto the field. And that flashback ability, I think, in my mind, makes it playable in Standard. Next, we've got Splash Portal for a blue mana. You get a sorcery, and you get to exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. If you control a bird, frog, otter, or rat, you get to draw a card. So this is a flicker spell, and I think in blue decks that have birds, frogs, otters, or rats as a protection spell, I think this is a good card. And that ability to draw the additional card, I think, makes it something that's playable in Standard. Next, we've got Into the Flood Maw for a blue mana. You get an instant with Gift a Tap Fish. Return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. If a gift was promised, instead return target non-land permanent opponent controls to its owner's hand. So, this is basically an unsummon with potentially the upside of being able to not only send a creature back, but any non-land permanent if you're willing to pay the gift cost of a tap frog creature token. Next, we've got Long River Lurker for 2 and a blue mana. You get a Frog Scout. That's a 2/3 with Ward 1. And other frogs you control have Ward 1, which I think is something that if we do see a frog deck form, is a nice ability to give to all your frogs. And when Long River Lurker enters the battlefield, target creature you control cannot be blocked this turn. And whenever that creature deals combat damage, this turn you may exile it. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So I think if we're in a situation where we've got a powerful creature that we want to be able to, in essence, flicker, it does combat damage, it flickers, and it comes back in, and we get the enter the battlefield trigger a second time. I think if we have cards like that in a frog deck, then I think this is a card that people want to have a couple copies of to take advantage of the flicker effect. All right, moving on to some black cards. The first is Bandit's Talent for 1 and a black mana. On level 1 of this enchantment, that's a class. When Bandit's Talent enters, each opponent discards 2 cards unless they discard a non-land card, which is, to me, right on value for that. And then for an additional mana, you can move to level 2, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, they lose 2 life, so a burn effect. And then for 3 and an additional black mana, you can move to level 4. And at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in hand. So in the mid to late game, I think this becomes a very powerful card where you're able to deal direct damage to your opponent, and I think that makes it playable in Standard. Next, we've got Huskburster Swarm for 7 and a black mana. You get an elemental insect. That's a 6/6. And this creature costs 1 less to cast for each creature card you own in exile and in your graveyard. It also has Menace and Death Touch. So this fits right into any graveyard strategy that exists in Standard. And because of that, I think you're probably getting this down to 2 or 3 mana, and then getting a 6/6 with Menace and Death Touch that your opponent has to deal with. Otherwise, it'll win the game in a couple of turns. So in that graveyard deck, I think this is a nice fit. Next, we've got Moonstone Harbinger for 2 and a black mana. You get a Bat Warrior. That's a 1/3 with flying and Death Touch. And whenever you gain or lose life during your turn, bats you control get +1 and gain Death Touch until the end of turn. This ability triggers only once each turn. So I think, again, this is another quality card in a bat deck where, again, we've already talked about the fact that a number of our bats are lifelinkers. So when we gain life or we lose life because we're using a pain land, then the upside of it is that all of our bats are going to get that +1 and gain Death Touch. So anything that does have the ability to block that, it might be in the air, is going to die in the process. So I think this is going to be a part of our bat deck. Next is Persistent March Stalker for 1 and a black mana. You get a 3/1 Rat Berserker, and Persistent March Stalker gets +1/+0 for each other rat you control. So on the surface there, because it doesn't have trample, I don't think it's a great card on its own in Standard, but what I think is going to make this something that people want to consider is the Threshold ability, which whenever you attack with 1 or more rats, if 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, you may pay 2 and a black mana. If you do, return Persistent March Stalker from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. And I think that shock ability or surprise ability of pulling it out of your graveyard at that point and then it's attacking, I think makes it playable in a Rats deck. Next, we've got Stargaze for X and 2 black mana. You get a sorcery, and you get to look at twice X cards from the top of your library and put X cards from among them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, and you lose X life. So for 2 or 3 life in the mid game, or even more potentially, you're going to get 3, 4, maybe even 5 cards, and being able to dig twice that many cards in your deck, I think, is a powerful ability that black decks will want to at least have a copy or 2 of in Standard. Next is Crustacean Mage for 1 and a red mana. You get an Otter Wizard. That's a 2/2 with Offspring of 2. And when you cast a non-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So we've got already a couple cards like this in Standard that are not seeing play. So I would assume that this probably doesn't see play, but because we're probably going to see an Is It Spells deck, maybe a copy of or 2 of this goes into that, because you get that double bonus late in the game of being able to cast it with its Offspring ability and get that additional 1/1 token. And because of that, I think it's got a little bit of Standard playability. Next is Harnesser of Storms for 2 and a red mana. You get an Otter Wizard. That's a 1/4. And whenever you cast a non-creature or otter spell, you may exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. This ability triggers only once a turn. Because you can, in essence, exile the top card of your library, but just by playing a spell, I think that makes this playable in Standard. Whether it's good enough to be a part of any Tier 1 deck, I'm not sure on that point at the moment, but it's certainly something that people will have to consider in an Is It Spells type deck. Next, we've got Bark Knuckle Boxer for 1 and a green mana. You get a Raccoon Berserker, that's a 3/2. And whenever you expend 4, Bark Knuckle Boxer gains indestructible until end of turn. You expend 4 as you spend your 4th total mana to cast spells during a turn. So I like the fact that this can get indestructible just by playing cards and spending mana. And because of that, I think in the right kind of deck, this could be a solid Standard card. And our final card of the day is Vine Reap Mentor. For a black and a green mana, you get a Squirrel Druid, that's a 3/2. And when Vine Reap Mentor enters or dies, create a food token. So for 2 mana, you get a 3/2 and you get a food token. And I think that's good enough for Standard play. All right, those are the cards from today. We had a lot of things to talk about, a lot of interesting cards from the set today. We'll be back on Sunday for a look at the cards that are previewed over the weekend. And thanks for staying to the end of the video. And remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Bloomburrow spoiler season. And I've left links for a couple of the other preview videos from this week for you to take a look at. Thanks. I'll see you next time.